at some point towards the end, we'll get a chance if you want to ask any questions, you have any queries, anything at all, I'm sure Patrick's happy to help. So without further ado, I'll talk more and this format. Patrick, thank you.
Thank you. First of all, thanks so much to Susan for inviting me up to take part in this series of lunchtime talks at the Garden of Reflection. Lovely to be here, and I hope to look about a wee bit more before I leave. It's a tremendous facility, obviously now in the centre of the city. Susan said I'm going to talk today around a range of human rights issues, both at home and abroad, both to do with our own wee corner of the world here, but also setting that within the global context and some of the bigger challenges that we face around the world today. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that Amnesty does to try to make those human rights real for people. And I want to reflect on some of the challenges we face in the world, how we're trying to address them. I'm going to particularly have a concentration on dealing with the past in Northern Ireland because it's a very live issue at the moment, and we'll reflect on that a little bit. And I'm going to touch on a number of other issues, both locally and of international concern. I suppose almost to start with the start, we should look at the document that underpins all of our work, and that's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It dates from 1948. And those years following the Second World War and the devastation that had been wrought right around the planet, and all too often targeted at people, not because they were in a particular uniform, but at people who weren't in uniform at all, but who were targeted for persecution and for death because of simply who they were, what their identity was, their religious identity, their national identity, their skin colour, their gender identity, all sorts of reasons, mental health issues and the rest of them. People were exterminated on a grand scale, and I think in the wake of the Second World War, nations came together, formed the United Nations, and one of the first things they set about doing was trying to put in place mechanisms that gave meaning to the phrase "never again." And one of the first tasks was given to Eleanor Roosevelt to head up a group to create what we now know as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's a simple document setting out in very clear, straightforward terms, in 30 sentences or 30 short paragraphs, rights that we all have just by virtue of being born human. All sorts of rights, the right to fair trial, the right not to be enslaved, the right to have an education and basic health care and food in our bellies, and all those sorts of things that we like to think that people can take for granted. But you know as well as I do that turn on the 10 o'clock news or open a decent newspaper any day of the week, and you will see stories of how those promises that the world's governments made back in 1948 to their people, to the people of the world, aren't being kept, and how children are going to bed hungry without access to healthcare, without access to education. People are still facing lack of fair trials and persecution, and indeed violence and death because of who they are. And so I suppose Amnesty's role, how we see our role, is to take these promises that the world's governments made all those years ago and measure them up to the reality of the lives being lived by millions, billions of people around the world, and to challenge those governments or others with power both to affect human rights for better and for ill, to bridge that gap, to bridge the reality gap between the promises and the reality, and to eradicate the human rights violations that are taking place in the world, and to put in place measures, new laws, new practices, new policies that mean those abuses aren't repeated ad infinitum. And I think it's sort of obligatory in Northern Ireland these days when you're sort of giving a talk to quote from Seamus Heaney, isn't it? So I'll not sort of break with that practice. The quote I'm going to do is this, and it's Seamus. He said, "Even if the hopes you started out with are dashed, hope has to be maintained." And I think that Amnesty sees its role as being committed to maintaining that hope. And so the hopes that were set out for people in the wake of the Second World War, the hopes that are articulated in the 30 rights set down in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, those hopes are dashed day and daily for far too many people around the world. And I think the challenge for all of us is to make sure that we don't lose hope, that we maintain hope, and that we keep striving to make the world a little bit fairer, a little bit better, bit by bit, case by case, country by country. And I suppose that's our approach, and it would our motto. I think it's a Confucian one about better, don't curse the darkness, but to light a candle. And I suppose that's the Amnesty symbol as well, about lighting a candle to sort of shine out, despite all the barbed wire, literally and metaphorically in the world, is to light a candle and keep striving, keep moving forward, keep the hope alive. But we're no fools, we're not naive, we live in a big, bad world all too often, and times are not good for human rights at the moment. They absolutely are not. As I say, turn on the 10 o'clock news and you will see that any day of the week. And whether it's violent crisis in the Middle East, across so much of Africa, indeed within Europe as well, and right around the world, there are many people facing human rights violations on a daily basis. Last year, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees reported that the number of refugees under their mandate had reached 13 million people. That's the highest in 20 years. And while the total number of internally displaced people within countries who they were protecting or assisting reached a new high of 26 million people. The scale is such that it's as if the entire population of Spain were living as refugees. That's what we're talking about. And yet, what do we see in the news headlines? It's scare stories about people trying to get across from Calais, trying to get across the Med in rickety boats. There are now 4 million people, 4 million refugees from Syria alone. Lebanon has over 1 million of those people. So a third of its people are now living in a small and struggling country, not wealthy country like we have the privilege to live in, but it's the most underdeveloped and impoverished countries that are bearing so much of the burden of the refugee crisis that exists in the world today, which in turn has been caused by the wars that have been allowed to rage right across so much of the world. We know that people are still being tortured despite it being illegal to do so. Just looking at our files, and there's some horrendous stories in there. We know of cases of women in Mexico who are wrapped in cling film by the authorities so that the bruises from their beatings in custody don't show. We know about the police in the Philippines turning torture into a sort of a game to liven up a sort of boring afternoon down the police station. They created a wheel of tortures, like a wheel of fortune type thing, and depending on where the wheel stops, designates what sort of torture the prisoner is going to face that afternoon. This is illegal. We have laws, international laws and domestic laws against it, but it's still going on. So the struggle for human rights can never stop, and we can never be complacent. No matter what goes on the statute books, we have to be eternally vigilant. And we know of the devastating consequences for individuals. One of the cases, I suppose, that we've been highlighting over the last while has been that of Raif Badawi, the Saudi Arabian blogger who's facing years in jail and 1,000 lashes just for writing a blog. He wasn't calling for even the overthrow of the government in Saudi Arabia. He's promoting sort of liberal values, a liberal discussion board. And so, that's just one of many cases where Amnesty continues to stand with individuals, and we will continue to campaign until he is freed. And I know that colleagues from the Foyle branch of Amnesty, I think, are going to be joining tomorrow, I believe, with the NUJ here in the city, I think in Guildhall Square, to hold a vigil for Raif Badawi. And then there's all the stuff that doesn't make the news. There is a devastating war going on in the Central African Republic. When did you last see that on the 10 o'clock news? There are countries like West Papua, again not in the news, but where we know from more research the horrendous abuses are going on a regular basis. We of course do know about the horrendous abuses by the like of ISIS, Boko Haram, Al Qaeda, the war in Ukraine, and then there are the other rights that perhaps are rights abuses that perhaps are more hidden from view in that they're not making the news but are still deeply impacting on the individual's lives. We know about reproductive rights being rolled back in many countries. We know that life for LGBT communities in many places is getting worse, getting increasingly dangerous. But we can't give up hope. We have to maintain that hope. Amnesty's founder back in 1961, as Susan touched on, was a man called Peter Benenson. He was a London-based lawyer, and he issued a call for action initially, and with an article in a newspaper that was then syndicated around the world. And his words are as true now as when he wrote them back in 61. And this is just a little bit. He said, "The newspaper reader feels a sickening sense of impotence. Yet if these feelings of disgust all over the world could be united into common action, something effective could be done." And so despite what seems like an impossibly worrying state of the world, we can unite our common feelings of disgust along with our better side, our common sense of hope, and unite that into sort of effective action. And we can win battles, and we are winning battles, both locally and internationally. Amnesty and many other civic activists are winning battles week in, week out, and it is possible to make the world a better place. One priority for Amnesty, as it has been for many decades, is to stop torture. I've touched on that already. 38 years ago, Amnesty International actually won a Nobel Peace Prize for its campaign to eradicate torture. It resulted in the United Nations Convention Against Torture that sort of flowed from that campaign a few years later. And like the great sense of elation, we've won. Torture is now officially illegal around the world. Fantastic, great job done. Let's go home. But our research from our annual report that we bring out in the spring of each year, it shows that last year torture was used in more than 140 countries. It's most of the world. Most of the world's governments are still using torture. How can this be when it's unequivocally against the law? And so I suppose our message still is, after all of these years, that we have to have zero tolerance of torture, and that has to start on our own doorstep as well as focused around the world in the Philippines or Mexico or anywhere else. In 1971, Amnesty International sent, as far as I'm aware, its first ever research mission to the UK, to here, to Northern Ireland, early years of the Troubles, and it was to investigate allegations of mistreatment of internees, just after the first wave of internment in 71. And our subsequent research report helped tell the world about what was happening here, in particular what was happening to that group of men that subsequently became known as the Hooded Men. Last year we took up their case again, and we pressed the Irish government successfully, I'm pleased to say, to lodge an application with the European Court of Human Rights to have the 1978 Strasbourg court decision in the case revisited in light of new evidence that was uncovered by Pat Finucane's Centre here in the city and RTE's investigations unit. The decision of the European Court in 1978 overturned the previous decision on appeal from the UK. The original decision had determined that the men had indeed suffered torture. The appeal decision in 78 determined, well, actually, no, it wasn't that bad. It was cruel or inhuman and degrading treatment, but it didn't meet the threshold of torture. And that was, I think, a terrible blow to the men, but it was also a terrible blow for the campaign against torture worldwide. In the case of the revelations about torture having been perpetrated in Northern Ireland, the Prime Minister of the time issued a prohibition against the British Army or any UK forces using those torture techniques again. But I think in the wake of that flawed decision in 1978, that that prohibition, that taboo on the use of torture weakened. And so by the time we got to the War on Terror, a decade or so back, we saw those techniques being rolled out once again. They resulted in the death of Bahamouza, an Iraqi waiter, I think he was a hotel worker, who died while in British Army custody in Iraq. And we know from looking at the Senate committee report, the US Senate committee report into the use of torture by the US in the war on terror, that those techniques were rolled out again. In fact, we know the legal advice created by the US Attorney General's Office for the White House back in 2001, when they were formulating the war on terror and how it was going to be waged. They actually cited that 1978 Hooded Men judgment to signal, if you like, what was acceptable and what wasn't acceptable. And that paved the way for what the CIA euphemistically called enhanced interrogation. And we saw the fruits of that in Bagram Air Base and Abu Ghraib and all those other torture chambers. So we can't give up on even those battles that we appear to have won. We need to keep revisiting that. We did a survey recently into public opinion in the UK towards torture, and on the upside, we were delighted to see 86% of UK citizens supported clear international laws against torture, banning torture. But when they were pressed a little bit further, almost a third, 29%, said that they thought torture was acceptable under certain circumstances. The whole ticking bomb scenario that's usually rolled out. Well, if you can sort of paint that sort of picture, then people think, well, you can use torture. So that, that is the warning to us all, to not let down the guard, not to become complacent, and to keep the focus, and to just continue to make the case, and we continue to do so. So the Hooded Men case is an important one for those men, for the families of the men who have died since, but also, its ramifications internationally. We're also aware, though, that's just one case of human rights violations that took place in this place over the course of 30 years, and that there are many, many thousands of other people who suffered both at the hands of state and non-state agents of paramilitaries within Northern Ireland. Going on for nearly 2 years ago, Amnesty published a report on dealing with the past in Northern Ireland, detailing sort of how and why the existing framework for investigating human rights violations and abuses here wasn't working, was letting down victims, family members of those who had lost their lives, and letting down wider society as well by failing to investigate and interrogate the past properly and hold to account those who were responsible, not just the people who pulled the trigger, but those people who sent out the trigger men. Since that time, since our report came out, we and many others have continued to campaign, and we called for sort of a whole new approach to investigating the past, a sort of comprehensive overall approach to do it in an effective and independent manner. Since then, we've had the Haas O'Sullivan talks, we've seen the end of the PSNI Historical Inquiries team, and then last December, just on the cusp of Christmas, we saw the Stormont House agreement. And we think that agreement can provide a framework for the future to how to successfully deal with our collective past. But there's some warnings there as well. I don't know if anybody sort of saw the front page of the Belfast Telegraph, it was yesterday, or the Nolan Show discussion that followed it, where they focused on one element of the Stormont House agreement, namely the Independent Commission on Information Retrieval, and the supposed revelation that it will not publicly name perpetrators of abuses during the Troubles. I have to say, when I saw the article and heard the debate on Nolan, it seemed to me like this was a case of Stormont House agreement for slow learners, in that this has been known information, this has been public domain information since the 23rd of December last year, when the agreement was first published. The agreement, and this was sort of brushed over in the media reports yesterday, the agreement actually provides for a range of a whole new set of institutions and mechanisms to deal with the past in Northern Ireland, to sort of try to knit together. We'll only see in the working out of it how well they do that, but of which the Independent Commission for Information Retrieval, the ICIR, is just one of the institutions, and there was rather less focus on what we see as the main institution here, I suppose, that proposed under the agreement. That's the Historical Investigations Unit, the HIU, and the quote from the agreement, that's an independent body to take forward investigations into outstanding troubles-related deaths. The ICIR, it is in turn to enable victims and survivors to seek and privately receive information about the deaths of their next of kin. Running alongside that, we have an oral history archive, and I think there's an example of that in some of the work that's done out of this centre. But the oral history archive is to be a comprehensive, a central place to share experiences and narratives related to the Troubles. There's to be an implementation and reconciliation group, and I quote again, to oversee themes, archives, and information recovery. And finally, there were a number of recommendations for new services for victims and survivors, including a mental trauma service. So while many organisations might suggest and individuals might suggest different models to deal with the past than that's provided for in the Stormont House Agreement, the reality is that that's the model that has been agreed by the two governments and the executive parties, and that's the model that is now actively being taken forward by those governments and those parties. But we want to be quite clear from our point of view, the implementation, the successful implementation of the Stormont House Agreement elements on dealing with the past will require continued focused work by many in the community, as well as focus on the detailed legislation to ensure that those mechanisms are brought to fruition and we're not left with legal loopholes that fail victims and fail wider society in the way that some of the mechanisms have done so to date. With the agreement of the local parties, the UK government is planning, I think in the very near future, to start publishing sort of draft legislation for consultation, and to follow that, draft legislation will start to make its way through the Westminster Parliament. And I think while there's broad agreement that the Stormont House Agreement provides a strategic framework, the devil, as often in these things, will be in the detail as to whether the new institutions will meet human rights requirements of independence and effectiveness, and whether they will be fit for purpose to do effectively what some of our previous mechanisms have failed to do. We're very conscious that many other initiatives in the past have unravelled or not delivered in a way that many of us would have hoped. And I think it's going to be important that we all continue to work together to ensure that this does not happen with the proposals in the Stormont House Agreement, and that we resist sort of the unravelling or the rollback of the present proposals, because that could well happen. And I think we should be alive to maybe why certain leaks about certain parts of the government proposals are now being made to journalists to focus on those elements rather than the comprehensive package. But here are some of the questions, I suppose, that Amnesty International has around the agreement, and we support it in principle if it is implemented correctly. But these are some of the relevant questions. When the agreement talks about being victim-centred, how is that going to be made real and not just jargon? When the agreement appears to be gender blind, how can we ensure that the different experience of women in the conflict here is reflected in the delivery and outworking of that agreement? What about truth and justice for those who suffered torture and serious injury but appear to have now vanished from the text as we move from the Haas-O'Sullivan draft agreement to the text we now have under the Stormont House Agreement? They were in the first, they're not mentioned really in the second. The Stormont House Agreement uses the term criminal investigations in relation to new cases and discussing the powers it will have. But will it also be able to establish wider accountability, like a sort of an organisational accountability, not just individual criminal culpability? Will the Historic Investigations Unit be able to access all the intelligence information held by the PSNI and the government agencies in order to do its job properly? Will those working for the HIU be properly independent in the way that those working for the HET until recently were certainly not? Will the HIU be able to establish links between cases so that questions concerning patterns and systemic issues that arise can be answered? Will all sides of the conflict, state and paramilitary alike, cooperate with the Independent Commission on Information Retrieval to ensure that bereaved families finally have a chance to more fully understand the circumstances of those deaths? Will the UK government provide sufficient resources for these mechanisms to work effectively and promptly? we know that £150 million has been pledged by the UK government, but frankly, knowing the scale of the task and what needs to be done, that seems very likely to fall far short of what is needed. And the 5 years that have been set down as well as the target for these institutions to work also seems to be optimistic, let's say. And what happens when those 5 years are completed? Do we have a guillotine come down on the process? And what about those cases that are maybe potentially left behind? And indeed, does that then in itself provide an incentive for people to obfuscate and non-cooperate? Will the Irish government put in place legislation or other measures to ensure that they facilitate proper cooperation with investigations here in Northern Ireland and the disclosure of information to the HIU? That's a lot of questions. There are more as well, but I think again I want to really just focus now on this matter because it's just about to appear above the horizon, and I think that a lot of community eyes need to be focused on it and to make sure that we don't have another missed opportunity. Because the prize, if we get it right at last, nearly 20 years after the Good Friday Agreement, the prize is great. In order to be finally, as best can be done at this stage in history, to deal effectively with that legacy of human rights violations and abuses. But equally, the prize is terrible to contemplate if we get it wrong, because if we get it wrong now, there probably won't be another chance, and that's a missed opportunity by our generation that in a way will be passed to the next. I want to move on and talk about a few other issues. Next week, this city will host Foyle Pride. Indeed, I'll be back myself to take part in the Pride Parade on Saturday week. And Foyle Pride has grown massively in reputation and scale over recent years, and I think that's down to the commitment of local LGBTI activists here in the city, who I know have ensured that human rights are at the core of Foyle Pride. In a way, maybe they've slipped from view in some of the glitzy prides that happen elsewhere that have simply turned into parties, celebrations, which is grand. But I think there's a place for politics in Pride. Certainly in this place there is. We're very conscious that across many countries, including across Eastern Europe, LGBTI activists have been banned from holding their own Pride parades. And I suppose that's why we march, why we participate in those events, because we're marching for those who cannot, and we're marching for those who are persecuted because of their sexual orientation or their gender identity. We know that in some parts of the world, being gay or having a same-sex relationship can mean a prison sentence or a death sentence. And we know that it's not just in far-flung places where there are problems. Here in Northern Ireland, LGBTI people, same-sex couples face a range of inequalities, including now the prospect of finding themselves in the only part of these islands without the right to equal civil marriage. We're very clear, that's discrimination. It's unacceptable, and it's going to have to change, and change it will. And whether that change comes through stormont or through the courts, Amnesty is sort of part of that push for equality, and we're working alongside other actors in civil society from the LGBT community, but also wider partners like the trade union movement locally, just in the way that we are also trying to do so in the likes of Uganda and Russia, where people face egregious human rights violations and come under severe threat because of their sexuality. Another of Amnesty's global priority campaigns at the moment is called My Body, My Rights. It's about the freedom to make decisions about your own health, sexual life and identity. As far as we're concerned, that's a fundamental human right. But we know that globally there are conservative lobbies which aim to control the bodies and the lives of women and girls. There are reactionary and religious forces who are trying to delete references to sexual and reproductive rights from international agreements. We see in certain parts of the world a clampdown on access to abortion and contraception. And so Amnesty's My Body, My Rights campaign is targeting places where human rights defenders and health workers trying to provide the best care possible for their patients face particular intimidation, threats of violence and coercion. take just one of those countries, and sadly there are too many, but one is El Salvador, and there we have seen women imprisoned for having miscarriages, wrongly accused of having illegal abortions or even aggravated homicide, and convicted on no evidence. Of course, we know that, again, those problems simply aren't in far-flung places either. In Northern Ireland, we need change too, in the Republic as well. North and South, we have some of the most draconian abortion legislation anywhere in Europe. And we want that to change, and we want laws here to come into line, at least with minimum international human rights standards for access to abortion. That means in cases of severe or fatal fetal abnormality, and in cases of pregnancy through rape and incest. Surveys commissioned by Amnesty in Northern Ireland show that between 60 and 70% of people who live here would support a change in the law to allow abortion under these circumstances, and with maybe 1,000, maybe more women a year forced to leave Northern Ireland to access abortions in England, this change cannot come quickly enough. And as with gay rights, it's a case of needing our politicians to catch up with our people. And just as maybe people found out with the marriage equality referendum in the South, what has long been deemed to have been a socially conservative country, maybe isn't anymore. Maybe times have changed, and maybe people see things in new ways, and maybe this place has changed too in some of these issues. I touched earlier briefly on the sheer numbers and the growing scale of refugees in the world, and I think if there's one thing that I suppose we hope binds and defines us as people, it's empathy, connecting with the experiences and the suffering of others. And I think the way that humanity treats refugees shows if those connections are strong or if they're weak and indeed broken. I have to report that sort of right now, big parts of the world, including our own country, aren't doing well at all. I suppose a year or two ago, Amnesty lobbied hard to get the UK government to change its refusal to take any refugees at all from Syria, and they agreed in the end to establish a resettlement programme. Again, it seemed to be a significant achievement, but now going on for a year and a half later, I think the last time I looked at it, there were only 143 Syrian refugees had actually been resettled in the UK under that programme as a response to a problem facing 4 million people. It's absolutely ridiculous, it's utterly terrible. So I suppose our commitment is that we're going to continue to work relentlessly to ease the plight of refugees, and that includes finding much better solutions for those who are currently being left to drown in the Mediterranean. Over the summer, we've seen repeated stories of how the Italian Coast Guard, the Irish Navy and others have picked up thousands of desperate people and who had taken to sea in sort of rickety, dangerous vessels. But we also know that countless other thousands have died as their ship sank, their boat sank. The UK government, along with others, stated that they would not support proper search and rescue operations as they believed it would act as a pull factor. They withdrew support, the search and rescue services were cut, and yet those desperate people, and who can blame them, are still taking to sea in search of sort of a way of, not simply of a better life, but actually to save their lives. So we can't simply leave people to drown in the Mediterranean and claim that rescuing them only encourages others to make that dangerous journey. And we're continuing to urge governments right across Europe to act. And locally, we would like to see the authorities here in Northern Ireland, the executive, signal their intention to rehouse some of those forced out of Syria by the fighting there. And we're part of a group of local NGOs working to that end, and we don't have a decision yet, but that's what we would like to see happening. The Irish government recently announced that it would take in, I think, about 600 from Syria and elsewhere. And I think if we in this part of the world can't have empathy with people fleeing war and conflict after the years that we have been through, then I think this post-conflict society is in maybe bigger trouble than we thought. So, in conclusion, I just really want to say that Amnesty tries to work by bringing together all our individual voices of outrage into the sort of more effective, more unified, sort of powerful cry for change that those in power to make a change can listen to. And through the efforts of Amnesty's individual members, local school groups, student branches, and those who join in to support our campaigns ad hoc, online, and street demonstrations, or wherever it might be, we can and we do make a difference. And we're just part of a wider international human rights movement. And I suppose I'll finish with another quote, not one from Seamus Healy, I'm not sure who this one comes from. If you think you're too small to have an impact, try going to bed with a mosquito. Listen, that's it. Listen, that's my opener for 10. There are loads of issues that I didn't touch on at all, including local ones around institutional clerical abuse, Kincora, and other issues that we've been campaigning very active on, as well as multiple sort of global issues. I'm happy to talk about any of those or other issues that we haven't touched on, that I haven't touched on at all today. I don't expect we'll all agree on everything. That's fine too. This is a conversation, and these are tough issues that we're trying to find. It's rare that solutions are simple. So, yeah.
That was really wide-ranging, and there's great kind of commitments to human rights that people should be measured against. So just thinking back to Amnesty International 30 years ago, when I was first aware of it, it used to be much more narrow in dealing with prisoners of conscience, which was defined as kind of people in prison for expressing opinions, or there was a narrow definition for non-violent offenders, and it was really effective at that. Is there a danger that how you kind of broadened it out? I mean, it was so much ground you could have, all-day conversations about each of the issues that you talk. Is there a danger that by kind of broadening it out so much that you're losing effectiveness? When it was so focused, it was effective because
Yeah. So. Yeah, of course, there's always that danger. There's so much in the world to do, and how do you prioritise? So Amnesty started back as a campaign for amnesty. That's why we have that name, a campaign for amnesty for people we designated as prisoners of conscience in jail for the peaceful expression of political or religious views. And that was back in the '61 Cold War days when that happened to people on all sides. But I think then we found ourselves facing more complex world, and so that was like cherry picking one particular violation experienced by one particular group of people. And so even say with that group of people, prisoners of conscience, when they were being tortured, were we able to raise our voices against that? Well, not if we only had maybe a very narrow focus. So anyway, long story short, Amnesty over the years has widened its brief, and we took on the issue of torture, as I touched on that. We took on, I think in the 1970s, the issue of the death penalty. That was a very controversial issue in its time. I think probably much less controversial nowadays, because most of the world has shifted to being abolitionist, and in those days there are a number of remaining countries where that battle still needs to be won. And eventually we decided that we needed to work on and be able to work on all human rights issues, because there were so many interlinkages, and to try and cherry pick certain ones that we would work on and to ignore other ones we didn't think worked effectively. So ultimately we adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights essentially as our underpinning document, and that has a whole range of human rights: the civil and political rights, like the right not to be imprisoned unfairly and the right to a fair trial, the right not to be tortured and all of that stuff, but also the economic and social rights, the ones that sometimes are overlooked, so that are pretty important to people who aren't having those rights fulfilled, if they can't have access to adequate health care, if they can't have access to education for their children, etc. So for us, these are interlinked. there's almost an implication in your question that Amnesty is not effective now, or by working on a broader range. We think that we are, and we think that we continue to secure successes on a range of issues, and will continue to do so. We face the continual challenge to prioritise and to adapt, and we will continue to do that. But we think that we're more effective by being able to be flexible, respond to need, prioritise different campaigns at different times, and work both on those individual cases, and we continue to do so. Raif Badawi is one, Miriam Ibrahim, the Sudanese Christian woman who was in Sudan for apostasy there a year or so ago, that it was a case we adopted. So we continue to do that work, but we also need to campaign for systemic change, for law change, for policy change, for practice change, both at a national and international level, and we do that as well. So that's my sense of it.
Thank you.
Yeah, you referred to gay rights.
Mm-hmm.
What about the inequality created by the institution of same-sex civil partnership? Ordinary people, there are non-gay people who live together for various reasons, but they're denied the rights and the benefits that same-sex civil partnership gives.
So we would agree with you. In our view, there should be no discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity, and what is available to one couple should be available to others in terms of civil marriage or civil partnership. So we would like to see the law equalised. For us, it's not a particularly difficult concept to accept that all people are equal and the law should apply to all people equally. So the case that you point up would be...
You get, say, a couple of siblings, maybe elderly siblings living in the family home. One of them dies, the other one has to get out of the home to sell it to pay the taxes. Or you get a lone parent with a child, or maybe several children. When that lone parent dies, those children have to pay the taxes on the property. So there's inequality, discrimination.
Is that based on the fact that the individual isn't married?
Yeah, because they're not married. They could be the same sex, different sex, but they're living together for economic reasons, for mutual support, whatever. For similar reasons to what gay couples will want to live together for. But they're denied the benefits that a gay couple gets.
Well, I suppose where we're coming from, where international human rights law stands, is that people should not face discrimination based on their intrinsic being, based on their sexual orientation or their gender identity. So I'm not sure that transfers to the situation that you're pointing up of siblings or individuals.
Well, but a gay couple can live together and be the same as a straight couple living together. They don't need a special dispensation or ceremony or
well, except they can't at the moment. They can't have a civil marriage, so they are denied the same as is available to an opposite sex couple.
What's the difference between civil marriage and civil partnership?
There are some technical differences around pension rights, for instance, and you touched on that. But there's also something symbolic in our society, where society recognises a loving relationship, a loving sexual relationship, or the possibility of being a sexual relationship between a couple by through marriage, through civil marriage. What churches do should be a matter for churches, but in terms of what the state administers or recognises in terms of civil marriage, we think should be available to either opposite sex or same-sex couples.
So if a pair of siblings, same-sex or different sex siblings, say, okay, we're going to have a sexual relationship, give us these rights.
No, because that's incest, and that's.
I think that's a very good point, because
it's not, because
what
incest is
business
actually
is it
not.
of the state whether a couple has a sexual relationship or doesn't have a sexual relationship?
Well, I think there are.
I'm actually for civil partnership for everybody, and marriage should just be a church
Let's
thing.
not try
But,
and move away.
so
Sorry, Philippa, let's not try
yeah,
and
so there
move.
should be some contractual arrangements for
Philippa,
people who are too close. A relationship should be, have legal sexual relationships. property rights and rights.
Well, I think if people, if you want to campaign for state recognition of incestuous relationships, you should feel free to do so. Amnesty won't be joining you in that campaign. Well, I seem to be heading in that direction. Yes, I'll bring in a couple of other. Yes.
You still have the policy of identifying arms producers, and particularly arms producers that are selling weapons to both sides and making a vast profit on it. Do you still do that, or is that?
Yes, so we campaign against the export of arms to buyers, states or non-state actors, where those weapons are likely to be used to carry out human rights violations, because we're a human rights organisation. So we're not against the arms trade per se. There can be legitimate defence reasons, for instance, for people to purchase arms. So we're not a pacifist organisation, just to be clear. And international law allows for the trade of weapons and allows for the use of self-defence by nation states, etc. But all too often, arms are traded to known human rights abusers, and that's where we campaign for such exports to stop. We do that both on a national level and a global level, so we campaign to have arms export regulations tightened and then administered in a very strict fashion. We've done that in the UK with Ireland, etc. But we also campaigned for 20 years to bring in a UN arms trade treaty that actually came into force last year, and I suppose we're now going to see how that will pan out. But the principle of it is that no country should be allowed to export weapons to human rights violators, or where those weapons are likely to be used to launch aggressive action. I think that's going to be an extremely tough one to follow through on, because who are the largest arms exporters in the world? It's the five permanent members of the UN Security Council. There are many vested interests at play here, but yes, that is an area for work, and we continue to work on that one. And it's
Have you identified any specifically? Have you identified any particular companies? Because if you can identify companies, then campaigns can be organised against the companies.
Well, yes, we have identified companies repeatedly over the years, but our focus is on the national governments, because as national governments allow for export licensing to allow those exports to be exported, to allow those weapons to be moved overseas, and it's the state at fault where that doesn't happen. Of course, a company could choose to act illegally, but in most cases they don't have to, because their host government allows them to trade these legally. So that's where we're trying to close down the loopholes and to make that more difficult. So yeah, sorry.
I was just going to ask, in what ways do you get the message out about the research that you do and the issues that are going on in other parts of the world that people mightn't be aware of? What ways do you try and sort of make people more aware?
In a range of ways. I mean, I suppose with any particular campaign or any particular research, we try and work out what's going to be the most effective way of getting from A to B to achieve our ends. Every piece of research we produce is now published online on the day that it goes public. It's available, therefore, for anybody with internet access to download. We translate, if like, those often meaty research reports into simpler to read versions, and that might be boiling it down to newspaper articles or blog pieces, or to a leaflet, or to a campaign badge or a sticker to communicate the core messages to different audiences. We try and work with, we do a lot of work with the media to try and use the media as a force for good, to shine a spotlight into dark corners where abuses are taking place, and they can be a powerful force for good in that way. And we try to equip our members and our supporters with the information they need in a range of ways that they can digest, so that they also can bring that information onwards, whether that be in running a stall in Guildhall Square, or writing a letter to the Derry Journal, or having a conversation over the family dinner table, and to get the message out in those ways. So as far as we're concerned, human rights law is not a matter for human rights lawyers, it's a matter for ordinary people to sort of take hold of and to use and to challenge. So I suppose we try to pop popularise or publicise all of that information. But back to this point of it, you can't do it all effectively all the time. So you select your audiences. So again, it's working out a campaign strategy. Who in the world is going to, can take the decision to end that human rights abuse or to bring that abuser to justice? How do we reach them? And work back the sort of the chain of power, the chain of influence, and that might be targeting, public opinion in that destination country, or it might be targeting governments around the world to put pressure on that government, or it might be any combination of the above. So we'll try and. So we're not sort of flooding the market with information, we're trying to target the information, but everything is available online. Yeah.
Do you have a little bit of time to talk about the decriminalisation of sex workers? I'm struggling with that one.
Okay.
I'm reading, and I'd like to know where that came out of and what's going on at the moment.
Okay, so it's been in some media over the last couple of weeks, because every couple of years, we're a democratic movement of members. Every Amnesty member can take part in sort of decision making at a national, international level, and so when decisions come up about new campaigns to take on or widening our brief, that's ultimately our membership takes those decisions. Our membership elects national boards, and in turn we have an international board. Every 2 years we have a decision making forum, like a conference, 500 delegates or whatever. It was last weekend, it took place in Dublin, and one of the many decisions that was before that decision-making body with these delegates from all around the world was about, should we adopt a policy, for the first time actually, because we didn't have a policy before, on the human rights of sex workers. We've been campaigning on related issues for many years. We've been, we're campaigning on human trafficking for many years. We sort of helped to sort of lead the campaign. I remember it some years ago, to get the UK government to sign up to the Council of Europe Convention Against Trafficking, which they didn't want to do, because again, they thought it would encourage dodgy migrants coming to the country. In the end, that battle was won on that. And we also worked on, health issues, and particular health issues that sex workers face. And so it was through our other work, we were in touch with sex workers and people working with sex workers, and it was a growing realization that this body of people, mostly women, are some of the most sort of stigmatized and marginalized and vulnerable groups in the world, who often find themselves doing that form of work for a whole multiple set of sort of bad reasons. Sometimes it's where it's trafficking or coercion. There are already laws against it, and we have, say, campaigned for those laws to be put in place. At other times, it's down to sort of really poor life choices that they're left with, maybe for reasons of lack of education or domestic violence they have faced, or other environmental factors that have forced them into these situations. In any case, sex work is a reality, sex workers are a reality, and they face human rights abuses on a very regular basis, and we have been carrying out research for the last couple of years to try to formulate what is the human rights response to these violations that they are facing. How can we formulate a policy that will focus on harm reduction and human rights protection of this vulnerable group of people. So a draft proposal or policy proposal went to our decision-making forum in Dublin last weekend. It was adopted and now is going to be turned into a policy by our international board. A key element of that, not the only element, but the key element that has attracted the media attention, is our call for sex work to be decriminalised. What we have found through this research, and we've done research around the world with sex workers, people who work with them, former sex workers, women's organisations, International Labour Organisation, World Health Organisation, etc., and trying to look at the problems and look at possible solutions. What we found was that criminalisation of sex work, whether that was the criminalisation of the sex workers themselves or the criminalisation of their clients, again mostly the men who use it, that criminalisation of sex work marginalises those, mostly women, away from the protection of the state, away from the protection of the police or other authorities, because they are fearful of ending up in jail or being otherwise, funneled into the criminal justice system. And so one of the conclusions we reached is that to decriminalise sex work, we think, is the best way forward to create a context of harm reduction for those people. It is not a panacea. There will continue to be problems, absolutely, with the situation facing sex workers, but creating an environment where criminal justice agencies do not need to be involved, nor do they need to hide themselves from criminal justice agencies, either because they're going to be the targets of it, or because, again, the mostly men who are buying their sex services are forcing them to help them hide from criminal justice agencies, from the police. So, a very practical point is lots of sex workers told us through our research that even in countries where the sex workers themselves were no longer criminalised, the so-called Nordic model, that the men buying sex from them did not want to go to their brothels or their homes, but instead were insisting that the sex workers came to their homes, somewhere where they did not feel safe, where the sex worker themselves did not control the working environment. So that, broadly speaking, is how we reached that destination. I know it's an issue of contention and controversy, and there are many who think that's not the right way to go. And we have, again, in the media, we've seen the arguments put backwards and forwards, and that So anyway, that's where we are on it. In terms of the Northern Ireland legislation that people will be aware of, that was passed here in the Assembly last year, that Lord Morrow had originally conceived as a private member's bill and passed with various changes. That we think is potentially problematic, and we raised various questions about it at the time it was going through the Assembly around these areas of concern. It has been reported, including in relation to this Amnesty policy story, that Northern Ireland legislation is now following the Nordic model. It actually isn't, and that in many cases sex workers, again mostly women here, are still criminalised for certain parts of what they do, including working together, being defined as a brothel and the rest of it. So anyway, that's now law here. We're all going to have to wait and see how that works out, and we will do the same. So we actually don't have our final policy yet. We have no plans at this stage to work on the issue in Northern Ireland. Maybe that will come at some point down the line. But yeah, so that's where we are with it. It's a very complex issue, but broadly speaking, that's how we got where we are with it.
Just quickly, Joel.
Sorry, just following on that, because you mentioned harm reduction and the general principle of people's autonomy over their own. I was just wondering, do you have a policy on kind of drug legislation around the world, which is changing in a lot of places, and a lot of it is targeting consensual private behaviour? Do you?
I think we don't, as far as I'm aware. Maybe we will. Maybe we will in the future. It's just taking these principles and then maybe putting them into practice. We don't at the moment.
Okay. I think that's.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. There, as always, a huge range of issues and topics, and we could spend a lot longer. And at some point, we will maybe get you back, and we'll maybe focus on something specific. I think would be a good idea. But listen, thank you so much. Thank you guys for staying and being here. Next week will be our last session for a while. It's poetry, so we're going to have a little bit of poetry next week. That'll be nice. Just a nice, gentle, and hopefully it'll not rain all day in the garden. Listen, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.